What's up, everybody? It's George Gabriel, and this is a showdown between the Scissor tool and the Marquee tool. Now you might be saying, well, the Scissor tool and the Marquee tool are really not the same thing, but their functionality is primarily editing either audio or MIDI, but they are distinctly different, and this showdown aims to look at which one you'd want to use in the situation where you're editing audio or you're editing MIDI, and what features each of them have, as well as the pros and cons of each of them. Check it out. Okay, we're here in Logic, and first we're going to take a look at the Scissor tool. In my secondary tools up above, you can see my Scissor tool is my tool of choice. When I'm hitting the Command key, it's going to bring that Scissor tool up. And the primary focus of a Scissor tool is really just to cut things. To activate the Scissor tool, all I really need to do is hit the Command key and just start cutting away. But the Scissor tool has got more functionality than that. There's a couple things that the Scissor tool can do that the Marquee tool cannot do, which makes it effective for certain types of editing. The first unique feature of the Scissor tool is that it scrubs the audio. So if I'm looking at something and I want to hear exactly what's being cut, I can hear it. Let me show you. If I select the Scissor tool by clicking Command, I can scrub the audio and hear exactly what I'm editing. So I'm going to select these two tracks here, and I'm going to hit the Command key, and you can hear the audio scrubbing take place, which is really helpful. There is one really cool feature of the Scissor tool that the Marquee simply doesn't have, and that's the ability to add the Option key while you're using the Scissor tool and dividing based upon the size of the cut that you're making. Let me show you. If I go down to this shaker part here, let's say I want to cut this shaker on every single transient, and the transients happen to be every 2 beats. Well, first I have to get rid of that first little area. So I'm going to cut this first, and then the next thing I'm going to do is select the Option key while I'm using the Scissor tool and watch what happens. It divides that entire audio region into equal sizes based upon how many beats or measures I chose. And that feature comes particularly useful if you want to do some really cool audio editing effects. If I want to do a stutter effect on my audio, what I can do is select the tracks I want to do the stutter effect on. I'll activate the Scissor tool by clicking the Command key, and then I'm going to add the Option key and watch what happens. I'm going to click this on the 16th notes, and now it divides that entire region into 16th notes. That's a pretty awesome little thing you can do. And to get the stutter effect, all I'm going to do is take every other region and mute them or delete them. This can be time consuming, but then it gives you an effect like this. So you can see how powerful this tool is in audio editing. Now, it's important to note that the Scissor tool doesn't only do this for audio, but it also does it for MIDI. Let's take a look. If I go to my piano part here and activate the Scissor tool, it has the same type of scrubbing effect that it does with audio, except it's scrubbing the MIDI. And in doing that with MIDI, it gives you additional options when you cut the MIDI. It's asking you 3 questions. Do you want to keep, shorten, or split that note across the point that the region is being split? And really, if you keep it, what it's doing is any note that comes before it stays there and doesn't get cut. But if the note is crossing over that cut, it shortens it if you choose shorten. And if you want to split it, which just splits it in half, that's what it does. Now, splitting it is great for loops. Shortening is great for when you're using strings and stuff like that and you want to shorten things. And keeping it is actually if you don't want to alter the original performance. It's very useful, especially if you have to have a hard out at like 29 seconds and your notes are going too long. Use the Scissor tool on the MIDI, cut the performance, and what it does is it stops the MIDI from playing. Very cool. So aside from scrubbing MIDI, the other thing that it does is it does that divide thing as well. So let's say I wanted to cut this in the beginning. Go ahead and split that note because I want it to actually show up. I'll cut off this beginning part, but if I decide I want to break this MIDI part up, add the Option key in, and let's say I do it on every bar, and it's saying, hey, do you want to split all these? Oh, let's keep them all. Now it's split that MIDI region into equal parts. Very, very cool. So to sum it up, the pros of the Scissor tool are that you can scrub your audio, you can scrub your MIDI so you can hear precisely where you're cutting. And the other pro is that you can use the Scissor tool with the Option key to divide your regions, which is very useful. And the only real con of the Scissor tool is the fact that it's just a Scissor tool. It just cuts things. There's not a lot of extra features other than the audio scrubbing and the dividing. Really easy to use, very effective. Now let's take a look at the Marquee tool. So I'm going to go up to my original audio here, this guitar part, and I'm going to double click on it. And you can see down here, I have the track. Now, the Marquee tool is part of the editor just by default. In other words, you don't really have to have it as a secondary tool. It's automatically there. So you can choose another tool if you want to down below in the editor, which is actually very helpful. For instance, if I want to use my scissor tool in the editor area, I can have that as my secondary. But note, if you look at my cursor, above it's a cursor, but as soon as I get to the bottom half of this, it automatically turns into the Marquee. Now, the similarities of the Marquee tool and the scissor tool are that you can cut up audio fairly easy with the Marquee. So if I choose my Marquee as my secondary tool up top, I have to activate it by using that command key, where I don't have to do it in the editor. I can have another secondary tool, but the Marquee tool has the same functionality as the scissor tool as far as cutting audio. It just does it slightly different. So to cut audio using your Marquee tool as a secondary tool, all you need to do is click the command key and really just double click any area you want to cut. And if you're using your Marquee tool in the editor, just go below the 50% mark of that region and same thing, just double click any area and it cuts the audio. Very quick way to cut audio. An added functionality that the Marquee tool has that the scissor does not have is the ability to actually select areas of that audio as regions, kind of like a cursor. So to do that in your timeline, obviously you need to use the command key to activate it, but you can see now you can actually select different areas and you can play that specific area very easily just by clicking play. That can be useful. The only downside of that, I think, is that it actually refocuses your cycle area to be wherever you selected. So that can be useful in certain applications and it can be annoying in other ones. But another way that the Marquee tool works nicely is if you select an area, let's say I want to pick these two bars, all I really need to do now is just click, not having to have any key down, and it'll separate those two bars out. That can be very useful. I will say the Marquee tool is a bit tricky to use though. You have to be pretty precise on where you're selecting. Otherwise, you're gonna have to do your selection multiple times. Now, one of the biggest features of the Marquee tool is a feature that allows you to right-click your area and apply other options to it. It can be very useful if you get the hang of using the Marquee tool. So if I right-click this area, you see all of these specific options come up. Let's go through these. For one, I can mute this area just by muting it. Boom, done. I also can expand the area by transients. Now that can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing, especially if your performance is not right on the nose. But you can see I can move the start point to the previous transient or the next transient, also the end point as well, which is cool if you're doing specific editing on things that have defined transients. Let me show you how that feature looks on something that has very clearly defined transients. So if I take my shaker here and I go from here to here, so if I want to expand this little area, I can right click and go say, hey, I want the end of this to go to the next transient. And you'll notice what it did is it didn't really take me to the next one. So I'd have to do it again. And this is where I think the Marquee tool for me actually falls apart. Now I'm spending a lot of time doing menu things when I could just be cutting it with the scissor tool or reselecting my area. So some of the other features when you right click a selected area using the Marquee tool is you can crop that whole region based upon that area. Boom, there you go. You can join and merge things. In this case, it's not really going to work, but you can do that as well. On the bottom section of this little area, you can see there's some other cool things. One of them is using that selection and applying specific effects to just that selection. So if we activate that, this little tool comes up and now you can actually add some plugins to this if you want to. And those plugins will only affect that area. You can also use that selection and bounce that region into place. And if you're using live loops, you can actually copy that selection to a live loop. So a lot of those same features are on any region if you right click them. In fact, quite a few more features are available if you right click any region. But some of the ones like muting and applying processing and all that kind of stuff is really already available without using the Marquee tool. It's just the Marquee tool is using specific selections that Logic thinks that you might want to use while using the Marquee tool. You'll notice that one thing the Marquee tool doesn't do when you're selecting audio is scrub. So you can't really hear exactly what you're selecting unless you hit the play button. Now, taking this down to the MIDI area, you can also use the Marquee tool on MIDI. So if I activate the Marquee tool in MIDI, it does the same functionality, but you'll notice there's less features when you right click it. Down below, it just shows me the piano roll. So there is no marquee down below once you are using it in MIDI. So it really has more functionality in audio than it does in MIDI. So let's look at the pros of the marquee tool. You can cut audio very easily like the scissor tool with the marquee tool, and you can also do selection-based editing with one click using the marquee tool, something you can't do with the scissor tool. The other pros of the marquee tool is it has added functionality when you right click it. It gives you lots of different options if you want to do some quick muting or bouncing in place or applying effects to that one area, something the scissor tool also doesn't have. But I find the con list for this is a lot larger. Number one, the marquee tool is a lot more difficult to use. Number two is it changes your cycle record area, which is something you may or may not want to do. And number three, you might find yourself getting frustrated with it because it'll do things that you don't want to do and you're ending up doing a lot of undoing. So in this showdown, I have to pick a winner. And for me, let's get the drum roll. It's going to be the scissor tool. It's got better functionality, it's got really cool scrubbing and dividing functionality that the marquee tool doesn't have, and it's a heck of a lot easier to use. That coupled with the fact that the right-clicking of the marquee tools, those extra functionalities that they bring, are already in the regions anyway, and actually quite more of them are already there, makes this a clear winner for me. But what do you think? Do you love the marquee tool and think that I'm crazy? Are you a scissor tool person like me? I'd like to know. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click that subscribe button, click the bell icon to be notified for future videos. Also follow me on Instagram at GGabrielMusic. And tell me what you think. I really want to know. Do you think I'm crazy for picking the scissor tool over the marquee tool? Drop me a comment. And I'll see you next time on George Gabriel Music.